They came home to a scene of slaughter. 10 of their companions, their friends, their brothers-in-arms lay on the ground, red with blood and dead. In their final desperate moments, the survivors carved a message into a slab of stone, a plea to God to be saved from the evil that had found them in this strange new world. But this message wasn't discovered in the windswept fjords of Norway or the ancient forests of Sweden. It was found tangled in the roots of a tree in the middle of Minnesota. The date carved into the stone wasn't 900 AD, during the height of the Viking Age. It was 1362, 130 years before Columbus ever set sail. What if the official history of America, the one you learned in school, is built on a lie? What if the first European explorers to penetrate the heart of the North American continent weren't Spanish or French, but a lost party of Norsemen, fighting for their lives, more than 600 miles from the nearest ocean? For over a century, a single 200-pound block of grey-wax stone has threatened to completely rewrite our national story. It is either the most important archaeological artifact ever discovered in America, proof of a forgotten chapter of exploration and tragedy, or it is the most elaborate and successful hoax ever perpetrated. And by the end of this journey, the line between fact and fiction will become so blurred, you won't know what to believe. This is the story of the Kensington Runestone. Our story begins not with Viking longships, but with a humble immigrant farmer. The year is 1898. Olof Oman, a Swedish immigrant, is doing what thousands of his countrymen came to America to do: tame the wild land and build a future for his family. He's clearing a patch of his 80-acre homestead near the small, unremarkable town of Kensington, Minnesota. It's backbreaking work. He's felling trees, pulling stumps, turning a dense, wooded hillside into arable farmland. One particular poplar or aspen tree is giving him trouble. It's about 30 or 40 years old, stubbornly rooted on a small, dry knoll overlooking a marsh. As he and his son strain to pry the stump from the earth, the gnarled roots finally give way. And clutched within them, like a secret held for generations, is a flat rectangular stone. It wasn't a boulder. It was a slab about 30 inches long, 16 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. Olaf likely would have tossed it onto the rock pile with the others, but his 10-year-old son, Edward, noticed something. Carvings, strange angular symbols like letters from some forgotten alphabet, were chiseled into the face and one side of the stone. Olaf, a man with only a basic education from Sweden, couldn't read them. Neither could his neighbors. To them it was just a curiosity. An Indian almanac, some speculated. For a while, the stone with the mysterious writing had a rather undignified fate. Olof Oman, the man who had just unearthed a potential historical bombshell, dragged it back to his farm and used it as a doorstep, a stepping stone to wipe the mud off his boots before entering his granary. This single mundane detail is one of the most powerful arguments in this entire mystery. If you were a brilliant forger, a hoaxer trying to fool the world and rewrite history, would you treat your masterpiece like a doormat? Or is this the action of a simple man who truly had no idea what he'd found? Word of the curious stone eventually spread beyond the small farming community. It caught the attention of a local businessman and amateur historian, who immediately suspected it was something far more significant. He saw the symbols not as random scratches, but as runes, the ancient alphabet of the Norse. He took the stone from Oman, and soon it was on its way to the academic world, first to Northwestern University in Illinois and then to scholars across America and Europe. The world's leading experts in Scandinavian languages and runology were about to pass judgment. And their verdict was swift, unanimous, and brutal. It was a fake, a forgery, and not even a very good one. The scholars scoffed. The runes, they said, were a clumsy mishmash of different alphabets and time periods. Some were from the 9th century, others were from the 16th, and some didn't seem to exist at all. The grammar and vocabulary were all wrong, more like 19th century Swedish than 14th century Old Norse. The numbers used on the stone were a particular point of ridicule. They were written using a system that rhinologists believed wasn't invented until centuries after 1362. To the academic elite, the case was closed. The Kensington Runestone was a modern fraud, likely cooked up by a bored or mischievous Scandinavian immigrant looking to play a prank on his new homeland. The stone, once a potential world-changing artifact, was dismissed, discredited, and sent back to Olof Oman in Minnesota with a note that essentially told him not to waste their time again. Humiliated and ridiculed, Olof Oman took the stone back. he reportedly said. "It's a liar and a fraud, and I don't want it on my farm." He threw it face down in the dirt by his granary, where it once again became a step, this time a monument to his public embarrassment. For nearly a decade, the stone that claimed Vikings had bled and died in the heart of America lay forgotten in the mud. But this is where the story should have ended, and instead it was just the beginning. Because the official explanation, the simple farmer hoax, left behind a trail of deeply unsettling questions. How could Olof Oman, a man who could barely write a letter in his native Swedish, have possessed the deep, albeit flawed, knowledge of ancient runes and linguistics necessary to create such a complex forgery? He had few books and lived in relative isolation. Where did he get the information? And more importantly, why would he do it? He never asked for money. He never sought fame. In fact, the stone brought him nothing but mockery and suspicion from his own community. He was accused of being a liar, a fraudster, a godless man trying to fool the world. His children were taunted at school. The ordeal cost him his reputation, not built it. People who knew him described him as an honest, hard-working, deeply religious man, not a cunning intellectual trickster. The profile of the man simply did not fit the profile of the criminal mastermind required to pull this off. The stone itself presented its own physical riddles. Geologists who later examined it confirmed that the weathering on the carvings was consistent with being in the ground for a very, very long time. The inscription was faded and worn, especially on the side of the stone that would have been more exposed to the elements. And then there was the tree. The roots of that aspen tree, estimated to be at least 30 to 40 years old, were wrapped tightly around the stone, holding it in a firm embrace. Neighbors and witnesses signed affidavits swearing they saw the stone entangled in the roots the day it was pulled from the earth. If the stone was buried before the tree started to grow, that would push the date of its burial back to at least the 1850s or 60s, long before Olof Oman even owned the land, and before the academic knowledge of runes was widespread enough for a frontier farmer to access. So, we are left with an impossible contradiction. The world's top language experts declared the writing a modern fake. But the physical evidence, the geology, the tree, the man himself screamed that it had to be ancient. One of these things had to be wrong. The scholars or the stone. For years, the academic verdict held sway. The stone was a joke, a piece of local folklore. But as the 20th century dawned, a new generation of investigators, unbound by the dogma of the old guard, began to look at the stone not as a text to be dismissed, but as a code to be broken. They started asking a dangerous question. What if the so-called mistakes on the stone weren't mistakes at all? What if they were clues? Clues to a lost dialect, a forgotten journey, and a truth so profound it would force us to rethink the very founding of America. The key, they believed, lay in re-examining those bizarre, incorrect runes that had gotten the stone laughed out of academia in the first place. And what they would uncover would threaten to vindicate the farmer from Kensington and turn the world of history completely upside down. The academic world had slammed the door, locked it, and thrown away the key. To them, Olof Oman was either a con man or a fool, and his stone was a worthless piece of granite. But history is full of doors that get kicked back open by stubborn people who refuse to take no for an answer. And the Kensington Runestone had found its champion. His name was Hjalmar Holland. Holland wasn't a university professor with a cushy office and a tweed jacket. He was a Norwegian-American historian, an outsider with a burning curiosity and, more importantly, a deep understanding of the Scandinavian dialects and history that the so-called experts in their ivory towers had overlooked. When Holland first saw the stone, he didn't see a clumsy fake. He saw a puzzle. He saw a story crying out to be heard. For the next 50 years, Hjalmar Holland would make the Kensington Runestone his life's work, a relentless, often lonely crusade to prove its authenticity. He started by going back to the source of the ridicule, the runes themselves. The experts had declared them a hodgepodge of characters from different centuries, with some that were just plain made up. It was like finding a colonial-era document written in Shakespearean English, but with the words dude and LOL thrown in. It just didn't make sense. But Holland asked a question nobody else had bothered to. What if the language itself had evolved? What if the people who carved this stone weren't using the official runes taught in textbooks, but the slang of their time and place? Think about it. The English you speak today is wildly different from the English of the 1800s, let alone the 1300s. Language changes. It drifts. It picks up new words and new symbols. Holland suspected that the carvers of this stone weren't academics. They were sailors and soldiers, men from isolated parts of Scandinavia where old ways and old dialects died hard, even as new ones were being born. So he focused on the most damning piece of evidence, the rune that made every expert laugh out loud, the so-called hooked X, used for the K sound. This rune simply did not exist in the 14th century, they all said. It was an open and shut case. But Holland, armed with his knowledge of obscure Scandinavian history, dug deeper. He scoured forgotten manuscripts and remote church records from the 13th and 14th centuries. And then he found it. The hooked X. It wasn't common, but it wasn't fake. It was a rare regional variant used in a few specific, isolated places in Sweden and Norway. Exactly the kind of places a royal expedition might recruit its men from. This wasn't a forger's mistake. It was a clue. A stunning, specific clue that pointed not to a 19th century Minnesota farm, but to a 14th century Scandinavian fjord. The academic world, however, was not impressed. It was a fringe variant, they argued. A fluke. But Holland was just getting started. He moved on to the next impossible feature. The numbers. The inscription used a strange system of dots and lines that looked nothing like Roman numerals, which any educated European of the 14th century would have used. This, the critics crowed, was the nail in the coffin. It was proof that the forger was an amateur who didn't even know how medieval people wrote down dates. Again, Holland looked not to the books of kings and scholars, but to the tools of the common man. He studied artifacts called primstavs, or Scandinavian calendar sticks. These were perpetual calendars, carved from wood or bone, used by farmers and sailors for centuries to keep track of seasons and holy days. And the numbering system they used? It was the exact same system found on the Kensington Runestone. These weren't the numbers of a high-ranking scribe. They were the numbers of a navigator, a soldier, a man of the people. The very kind of person who would be on a dangerous long-range expedition. The stone's strange numbers didn't make it a fake. They made it more real. They grounded it in the world of the working men who would have actually been there. Then there was the inscription itself. It begins with the line, 8 Gotalanders and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland to the west. This was another red flag for the skeptics. Gotalanders were Swedes. Why would Swedes and Norwegians, who were often rivals, be on a joint expedition? It sounded like a 19th century immigrant's fantasy of pan-Scandinavian unity. But Holland's historical research uncovered the truth. In the year 1319, the crowns of Norway and Sweden were united under a single king, Magnus Eriksson. For the first time in history, Swedes and Norwegians were part of the same kingdom, serving the same monarch. A joint Swedish-Norwegian expedition in the mid-14th century wasn't just possible, it was politically logical. The stone was fitting perfectly into a very specific and very real historical window. But the most powerful clue was hiding in plain sight. In 3 letters the original experts had dismissed as pure gibberish. AVM. At the end of the inscription the carver wrote, Ave Virgo Maria, save us from evil. AVM. Ave Virgo Maria. Hail Virgin Mary. The scholars had scoffed. Vikings were pagans worshipping Odin and Thor. They wouldn't be carving Catholic prayers onto rocks. This was the most ridiculous error of all. Except it wasn't an error. It was the key. The Viking Age, the era of pagan longship raids, was long over by 1362. Scandinavia had been Christian for over 300 years. The men on this expedition wouldn't have been carrying horned helmets and battle axes to appease Odin. They would have been carrying crosses and praying to the Virgin Mary for protection. The idea of pagan Vikings in 1362 is a modern cartoon. The reality was a deeply Catholic medieval kingdom. The prayer wasn't an anachronism, it was a timestamp. It was a cry for help from a group of terrified Christian men, lost in a hostile land, turning to their God and their Holy Mother for salvation. Suddenly, the hodgepodge of errors started to look less like a forgery and more like a dialect. A specific 14th century Scandinavian dialect, frozen in stone. A language in transition used by real people blending old runes with new ones, using common numbering systems instead of academic ones, and mixing in Latin letters for a Christian prayer. This wasn't the work of a 19th century farmer with a half-baked knowledge of runes from a book. This was too specific. The mistakes were too historically accurate to be mistakes. They were fingerprints, linguistic fingerprints left by a very real group of people at a very specific moment in time. Hjalmar Holland had done the impossible. He had taken every single argument used to dismiss the stone and turned it on its head, using each one as another pillar to support its authenticity. He showed that the stone, once ridiculed as a clumsy fake, was actually a remarkably sophisticated and nuanced historical document. But even with this mountain of linguistic and historical evidence, the mainstream academic world refused to budge. To them, it was all just clever interpretation. It was still just a story. To truly convince them, Holland knew he needed more than just words. He needed physical proof. He needed to prove that the stone itself, the very rock Olof Oman pulled from the ground, had been lying there undisturbed for 500 years. The battle over the language was over. The battle over the geology was about to begin. Hjalmar Holland knew that fighting linguists with more linguistic theory was like fighting a fire with gasoline. He had lost that battle. The academic world had declared the runes a modern fantasy. But the stone wasn't just words. It was a physical object. A 200-pound slab of greywack. And physical objects, unlike words, could be interrogated by a different kind of science. A science of time, pressure, and decay. Holland's new quest began not in a library, but back in the muddy fields of Kensington. He focused on the one detail that had been there from the very beginning, a detail everyone, including the skeptics, seemed to have overlooked: the tree. Olof Oman hadn't just found the stone. He had found it tangled in the roots of a mature aspen tree. The logic was simple, direct, and powerful. If you could prove the age of the tree, you knew the stone had to be older. A forger could carve a stone, but he couldn't instantly grow a 40-year-old tree on top of it. The problem was the tree was gone. It had been cut down, its stump cleared away years ago. All Holland had was the memory of the Oman family. So, in 1909, more than a decade after the discovery, Holland became a detective. He traveled to Kensington and tracked down every person who had been there that day. He found Olof Oman and his son Edward. He found their neighbor, Nils Flatten. He sat with them, listened to their stories again and again, and had them write down exactly what they saw. He had them sign sworn affidavits, legal documents testifying under oath. Edward Oman described how he had to chop through 3 major roots to free the stone. One root, he said, was flattened against the face of the stone, growing right over the inscription. Olof Oman swore that the tree was at least 10 inches in diameter, and that he estimated it to be around 40 years old based on his experience as a farmer. Their neighbor Nils Flatten backed them up. He saw the stone in the ground, saw the roots gripping it like fingers. To Holland, this was the smoking gun. A tree, likely decades old, had grown around the stone. This single fact pushed the timeline of the carving back well before 1898. It couldn't be Olof Oman, couldn't be some local prankster. But when Holland presented this evidence, the scientific community just shrugged. Why? Because of the tree itself. An aspen. Aspens are notoriously unreliable storytellers. Unlike a solitary oak, aspens often grow in clonal colonies, connected by a single massive underground root system. You can cut one down, and another shoot will pop up nearby from the same roots. Counting the rings of one trunk doesn't necessarily tell you the age of the root system it grew from. Furthermore, the stump was long gone. There was no way to scientifically verify the Oman's memory of its size or age. The affidavits were compelling human testimony, but to a scientist, they were just stories. Holland had hit another brick wall. But he wasn't done. If the tree couldn't talk, maybe the stone itself could. He needed a geologist. And he found the perfect one, Newton Horace Winchell. Winchell wasn't just any geologist. He was the former state geologist of Minnesota, a man of immense reputation and unquestionable integrity. In 1909, Holland convinced the Minnesota Historical Society to take a serious, scientific look at the stone, and they put Winchell in charge of the investigation. This was the moment of truth. Winchell wasn't a historian or a linguist. He didn't care about runes or grammar. He cared about rock. He spent months with the Kensington stone, examining it under a microscope, comparing it to other samples of greywack from the region. He wasn't looking at the meaning of the carvings. He was looking at the carvings themselves. How had they aged? What he discovered was fascinating. The inscription was clearly weathered. The surfaces inside the carved grooves were not fresh. They showed the same signs of aging and discoloration as the original untouched face of the stone. He noticed something else too. The stone was full of tiny glittering flakes of mica. On the main face of the stone, Many of these mica flakes had decayed and crumbled away over time, as you'd expect. When he looked inside the carved runes, he saw the exact same thing. The mica flakes inside the letters were just as decayed and weathered as the ones on the outside. This, to Winchell, was significant. It suggested the carving wasn't recent. A fresh cut would have revealed fresh, shiny mica. Then he looked at the parts of the stone that would have been buried. Olaf Oman had found the stone face down, and one edge had been exposed to the air while the rest was protected by the soil. Winchell observed a clear difference in the level of weathering between these sections. The side that had been buried was better preserved. The side that had been exposed to the Minnesota winters for centuries was more worn down. The inscription itself showed this same pattern of differential weathering. It was more faded on the exposed edge and sharper on the buried parts. In 1910, Newton Horace Winchell submitted his final report. His conclusion sent shockwaves through the academic community. He wrote, and I quote, "The inscription is, in my opinion, an authentic relic of an expedition of Northmen into the interior of North America." He went further. Based on his analysis of the weathering, comparing it to dated tombstones made of similar rock, he concluded that the inscription had to be of the date of the inscription, 1362 or thereabouts. This was a bombshell. A giant of American geology was staking his reputation on the stone's authenticity. For the first time, the Kensington Runestone had a powerful, credible scientific voice in its corner. The Minnesota Historical Society, which had previously dismissed the stone, now proudly displayed it in their museum. Newspapers across the country ran headlines celebrating the discovery. It seemed Hjalmar Holland had finally won. He had bypassed the subjective arguments of language and found his proof in the objective, undeniable reality of the rock itself. The geologists had seemingly proven the stone was ancient. The eyewitnesses had sworn it was entangled in the roots of an old tree. The case for the stone's authenticity had never been stronger. It was now a legitimate artifact, endorsed by the state's highest historical and geological authorities. But science is a relentless process, and while Winchell's report had answered many questions, it had also raised new ones. Weathering is not a perfect clock. Geologists in other parts of the country began to question his methods, arguing that local conditions could accelerate weathering dramatically. Could a stone carved in the 1880s and left in the acidic Minnesota soil look centuries old in just a decade or two? The geological evidence, as solid as it seemed, was still a matter of interpretation. And all the while, the ghost of the linguistic argument refused to be exorcised. The stone looked ancient. The rock told a story of centuries buried in the earth. But the runes were still speaking in a voice that sounded suspiciously modern. A new generation of scholars was about to put the language back on trial, armed with new evidence that would threaten to unravel everything Holland and Winchell had built. The battle for the soul of the Kensington Runestone was no longer being fought with shovels and pickaxes in the Minnesota soil. It had moved indoors into the quiet, sterile halls of academia, into libraries and linguistics departments. And the new weapons weren't maps and compasses. They were grammar books, dictionaries, and a ruthless understanding of how languages live, breathe, and die. The problem was, the language on the stone seemed to be a ghost, a linguistic chimera. It looked ancient, but it spoke with a modern tongue. Leading this new charge in the mid-20th century was a formidable scholar named Eric Wahlgren, a professor of Scandinavian languages at UCLA. Wahlgren was the polar opposite of Hjalmar Holland. Where Holland was a passionate, relentless advocate, a true believer, Wahlgren was a cool, methodical debunker. He approached the runestone not as a sacred relic, but as a potential crime scene. The inscription was his primary suspect, and he was going to interrogate it until it confessed. Wahlgren and a growing chorus of linguists began to point out features of the runic text that weren't just odd, they were screamingly anachronistic. It was like finding a smartphone in a photograph from the Civil War. The first major red flag was the vocabulary. Take the word for journey of discovery, or exploration, optagelsfart. It's a key word in the inscription, setting the entire stage for the tragedy that follows. Sounds perfectly plausible, right? But there's a fatal problem. That word, optagelsfart, doesn't appear anywhere in any known text from the 14th century. Not in legal documents, not in sagas, not in personal letters. In fact, linguists have traced its first appearance to the 19th century. It's a modern compound word, created long after the Viking Age had ended. as Scandinavians became fascinated with their own adventurous past. Finding it on a supposedly 14th century stone is like reading a letter from George Washington where he complains about airport security. It's a complete deal-breaker, a word out of time. Holland and his supporters tried to fight back. They argued that maybe it was a rare word, a term used by sailors that just never got written down anywhere else. But that's an argument from silence. For Wallgren, it was Occam's razor. What's more likely? That this is the single solitary surviving example of a word that existed for centuries without a trace? Or that someone in the 19th century, when the word was common, carved it into a rock? But the linguistic sins didn't stop there. The inscription mentions a journey of a certain number of days. The word used for this, depending on how you read the runes, is something like dagrise or dagsrise. Again, linguists scoured the archives. This specific form of the word was bizarre. It seemed to be a messy combination of Old Swedish and later Norwegian or Danish. A 14th century Norseman wouldn't have mixed his dialects like that. It would be like an American from 1776 writing a sentence that was half Shakespearean English and half modern Californian slang. Just doesn't make sense. It does, however, make perfect sense if the carver was a 19th century Swedish immigrant, whose own daily language was a natural blend of older dialects and modern grammar, speaking a version of Swedish that had evolved for 500 years after the stone was supposedly carved. Then came the grammar, the very bones of the language. The inscription says the explorers came from Vinland of the West, or AF Vinland of Vest. To a modern English speaker, that phrasing sounds completely normal. But to a 14th century Norse speaker, it would have been deeply strange. They would have said something more like, west from Vinland. The word order, the use of the preposition of, it all mirrors 19th century English or Swedish syntax, not medieval Norse. The carver seemed to be thinking in a modern language and translating it word for word into runes. This wasn't the natural flowing voice of a medieval explorer. It was the stilted, awkward voice of a modern man trying to imitate the past. The numbers were another glaring issue. The stone uses a mix of the runic alphabet for some numbers and a separate system of so-called pentatic numerals for others. This pentatic system was a real, but very obscure, system used in some parts of Scandinavia. But the way it was used on the stone was inconsistent and, again, looked like something pieced together by an amateur from a 19th century book on esoteric history, not the practical, everyday script of a man on the move. As these linguistic bombshells dropped, the focus inevitably swung back to the humble farmer who started it all, Olof Oman. Holland had successfully painted him as a simple, barely literate man, incapable of crafting such a complex forgery. But was he? The new generation of researchers started digging into Oman's life, and a very different picture began to emerge. Oman wasn't an uneducated hermit. He was a respected member of the community. He was literate in Swedish. He owned books, including a popular history book and a sort of home encyclopedia called Den Kunskapsrike Skolmästaren, or The Knowledgeable Schoolmaster. This book contained, among other things, a section on runes and a translation of the Lord's Prayer into a strange, artificial mix of Latin and Swedish. Suddenly, the idea of Oman as a forger didn't seem so far-fetched. He had the means, a basic knowledge of runes from popular books. He had the motive, perhaps a private joke among the Scandinavian immigrants in the area, a way to celebrate their heritage and maybe pull a fast one on the English-speaking establishment. Kensington was a tight-knit community of Swedes who were intensely proud of their history. They felt, perhaps rightly, that their role in building America was being overlooked. What better way to plant their flag, quite literally, than to create a document that proved they were the first? Eric Wallgren laid out this theory in his landmark 1958 book, The Kensington Stone, A Mystery Solved. He argued that Oman, possibly with help from a neighbor or a friend who had been a pastor in Sweden, concocted the inscription as a jolly prank. They used the grammar and vocabulary they knew 19th century Swedish, and mixed it with runes they found in popular books. They weren't trying to fool a professor from UCLA a half-century in the future. They were probably just trying to create a fun local legend. The evidence was overwhelming. The vocabulary was modern. The grammar was modern. The numbers were suspicious. The man who found it had the means and a plausible motive. For the academic world, this was checkmate. The linguistic analysis had exposed the runestone as a clever, but ultimately flawed 19th century fabrication. The case, which had been debated for over 60 years, finally seemed closed. The runes had spoken, and they had confessed to being a lie. But a stone is more than just the words carved on its surface. It's a physical object. It has a history written not in language but in chemistry and geology. The skeptics had proven, almost beyond a doubt, that the inscription was a modern forgery. But they had never truly addressed one of Hjalmar Holand's most powerful arguments: the weathering. The runes were carved deep into a slab of greywacke, a notoriously hard rock. And according to Holand's witnesses, those carvings looked ancient, faded, and worn by centuries of Minnesota winters. A fresh carving from the 1890s should have looked well fresh. The letters should have been sharp, their interiors a lighter color than the dark, weathered face of the stone. But they weren't. They looked as old as the rock itself. The linguists had put the words on trial and found them guilty. But now a new jury was being assembled. Geologists, armed with microscopes and weathering charts, were about to put the stone itself on the witness stand. The language might have been a 19th century ghost, but the rock had been sitting in the ground for 1 billion years. And it was about to tell a very, very different story. The stone's surface, a canvas of greywacke sandstone, is a billion-year-old diary written in the language of geology. And in 2000, a forensic geologist named Scott Walter was hired to read it. Walter wasn't a rhinologist or a historian. He was a rock guy. His job was to analyze concrete failures in modern buildings to figure out why things break. He treated the Kensington Runestone not as a sacred relic or a historical text, but as a piece of evidence from a crime scene. The crime? A potential historical forgery. The victim? American history itself. He was brought in by believers, hoping he could finally prove what they'd felt in their bones for a century. They had no idea he was about to become the stone's most vocal and controversial champion. Walter placed a slice of the stone under a scanning electron microscope. He wasn't looking at the words. He was looking at the wounds, the carved grooves of the runes. He was looking for one thing: weathering. See, when you carve into a rock, you expose a fresh surface. This new surface is like a newborn baby, vulnerable to the elements. Rain, ice, microbes, chemical reactions in the soil, they all begin to attack it immediately. Over centuries, this attack leaves its mark. Minerals break down. The surface becomes pitted and degraded. A carving made in 1898 would look pristine under a microscope, its edges sharp, its mineral grains fresh and gleaming. A carving made in 1362 and left in the ground for 500 years should look very, very different. And what Walter saw, he claimed, was a bombshell. He focused on the tiny flakes of mica and crystals of pyrite embedded in the rock. On the original uncarved surface of the stone, the part that had been exposed to the elements for thousands of years since the last ice age. These minerals were heavily weathered, almost gone. But inside the carved runes, he saw something fascinating. The minerals were also weathered. Not as much as the main surface, but they were clearly degraded. The sharp, crystalline edges of the mica flakes had softened and started to crumble into a clay-like substance. This wasn't the fresh, crisp surface of a recent carving. To Walter, this was the geological equivalent of a smoking gun. He estimated that this level of degradation would take, at a minimum, 200 years to occur. This single observation seemed to blow the 1898 forgery theory out of the water. If Olof Oman had carved the stone, it would have been in the ground for just 2 years before he found it. The runes should have looked brand new. But they didn't. They looked old. But the plot thickened. Walter noticed something else. The weathering inside the runes was different from the weathering on the face of the stone. It was less severe. This suggested to him that the stone hadn't been sitting out in the open for 500 years. If it had been, the runes would be almost as weathered as the rest of the surface. Instead, the evidence pointed to a long burial. Protected from the harsh freeze-thaw cycles and the acid rain of the Minnesota sky, the inscription had been slowly, gently aging underground, wrapped in soil. This perfectly matched the story. The stone was carved, left behind, and then buried, either deliberately by its creators or by the slow accumulation of dirt and roots over centuries, until Olof Oman's plow turned it up. For supporters of the stone, this was it. This was vindication. The linguists could argue all they wanted about grammar and dialects, but this was hard science. Rock doesn't lie. The case seemed closed. But in science, and especially in a controversy this heated, the case is never closed. Other geologists began to look at Walter's findings, and they weren't so sure. The first major problem is that dating rock weathering is notoriously difficult. It's not like carbon dating. There's no steady, predictable clock. The rate at which a rock weathers depends on 1,000 variables: the exact chemical composition of the soil, the amount of moisture, the temperature fluctuations, the types of bacteria present. Two identical stones buried just a few feet apart could weather at dramatically different rates. To claim you can confidently say something has been weathering for at least 200 years is, to many geologists, a huge stretch. It's an educated guess, but it's still a guess. Then a bigger problem emerged, one that struck at the very heart of Walter's argument. The Kensington Runestone is what's known as a glacial erratic. It's not native to the area where it was found. 10,000 years ago, massive glaciers scraped their way across North America, picking up boulders in one place and dropping them hundreds of miles away. This stone was one of those travelers. That means its main surface, the face of the stone, had already been weathering for thousands of years before anyone, Viking or Swede, ever laid a chisel to it. So a 19th century forger wouldn't be carving into a fresh, pristine piece of rock. They would be carving into an already ancient, weathered surface. This completely changes the equation. Of course the stone looks old, it is old. The question is whether the carvings are old. And the skeptics had an answer for that too. When they looked at the grooves, they saw something different from what Walter saw. They saw a suspicious smoothness. Centuries of microscopic freezing and thawing, of water seeping in and expanding, should have created a rough, pitted, crumbling texture inside the runes. Instead, in many places, the grooves looked almost polished. This led to a damning theory. In the late 19th century, schoolchildren and tradesmen often used what was called a slate pencil, a small hard stick of slate used for writing on chalkboards. A forger, after chiseling out the inscription, might have used a slate pencil or a similar hard tool to clean out the grooves, scraping away debris and smoothing the surface. This action would remove any loose, weathered mineral grains, creating a deceptively clean look. It would also explain the lack of severe pitting inside the runes. The very evidence of preservation could, in an instant, be flipped into evidence of a cover-up. Suddenly, the hard science of geology had become just as murky and debatable as the soft science of linguistics. For every observation Walter made, the skeptics had a counter-observation. Weathered mica could be accelerated by acidic soil. Lack of heavy weathering? The stone was buried, protecting it. Smooth grooves? A forger cleaned them out. The rock itself had become a Rorschach test. Believers saw undeniable proof of a 500-year burial. Skeptics saw the telltale signs of a clever 19th century hoax. The stone, which was supposed to be the ultimate witness, was giving contradictory testimony. The science, which was meant to be the final impartial judge, had only managed to create a hung jury. It was a perfect, beautiful, frustrating stalemate. The investigation had reached a dead end. If the language was a puzzle and the rock was a paradox, there was only one place left to turn: the story. The inscription wasn't just a collection of runes. It was a narrative, a desperate message in a bottle. It described a specific journey, a specific location, and a specific tragedy. The geology and linguistics were trapped in a circular debate, but the journey was a matter of geography and logistics. Could a small party of Norse explorers in the year 1362 even get to central Minnesota? What would that journey have looked like? The focus had to shift from the how of the carving to the why of the story. Because if the journey it described was impossible, then the stone was a fraud no matter what the microscope said. But if the journey was possible, well, that opened up a whole new world of questions. The stone had failed to provide answers. Now it was time to ask the map. And the map told a story that was, at first glance, completely impossible, utterly insane. For decades, this was the single biggest weapon in the arsenal of the skeptics. It was their checkmate. Forget the runes, forget the weathering. Just look at a map of North America. The stone was found in Kensington, Minnesota, 1,000 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, 1,000 miles of dense forest, impassable mountains, and unmapped wilderness. The inscription says the party arrived by ship. What ship? Did it grow legs and walk? Did it fly? The very idea of a 14th century Norse longship parked in the middle of Minnesota was laughable. It was the historical equivalent of finding a submarine on top of Mount Everest. Mainstream academics didn't just dismiss it, they ridiculed it. To them, Olaf Oman wasn't just a farmer who found a rock. He was a con man who couldn't even be bothered to pick a believable location for his forgery. He might as well have claimed they landed in Kansas. The inscription itself gives us two crucial geographic clues. First, it says the explorers were on a journey of exploration west from Vinland. Vinland, as we know from the Norse sagas, was their name for a settlement on the coast of North America. Most scholars place it somewhere around Newfoundland, Canada. So the party traveled west from the Atlantic coast. The second clue says they were camped by a lake with two skerries. That's a Norse word for small rocky islands, one day's journey north from where the stone was left. So the journey is west from Vinland, to a lake with two skerries, near Kensington, Minnesota. For years, everyone assumed this meant an overland trek, a brutal 1,000-mile death march from the east coast. But the stone explicitly says they had their ship. It also mentions that 10 of their men were killed by the sea, which was always interpreted as the Atlantic Ocean, where the journey began. Case closed. The geography just didn't work. It was the nail in the coffin, until someone decided to look at the map differently. They stopped looking at the land and started looking at the water. They stopped thinking about going over the continent and started thinking about going into it. And that's when they saw it. A backdoor. A massive gaping waterway that plunges deep into the heart of North America. A liquid highway that bypasses the Appalachian Mountains entirely. They were looking at Hudson Bay. This vast inland sea, the second largest bay in the world, is a behemoth. It bites a massive chunk out of the Canadian Shield, its waters reaching down, 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 until its southernmost point is almost parallel with London. And flowing out of it like arteries from a heart are massive river systems. One in particular caught their eye, the Nelson River. The Nelson River is not some gentle, meandering stream. It's a titan. It flows from the massive Lake Winnipeg, which itself is larger than some U.S. states, and empties into the Hudson Bay. And what flows into Lake Winnipeg from the south? Another giant, the Red River. And the Red River flows north, right through the western part of Minnesota, passing just a few dozen miles from Kensington. Suddenly, the impossible journey wasn't impossible at all. It was just audacious. The route was clear. Sail from Greenland into the Hudson Strait, navigate the massive Hudson Bay, find the mouth of the Nelson River, and then begin the long, arduous journey upstream, from the Nelson to Lake Winnipeg, and from Lake Winnipeg into the Red River. It was a continuous waterway, a silver thread leading directly from the Arctic seas to the Minnesota prairie. A 14th-century vessel, with its shallow draft, would have been perfectly suited for this kind of river travel. It was a long, dangerous journey, yes, but it was no longer a geographical fantasy. It was plausible. This theory, the Hudson Bay route, completely reframed the debate. It explained how a ship could be in Minnesota. It also recontextualized the inscription. The journey of exploration west from Vinland might not have meant they started on foot from Vinland. It could have been the name of the entire expedition itself, a royal charter to explore the lands west of their known world. And the 10 men killed by the sea? The original translation was Ved Havet, which can mean by the sea, but can also mean by the great water. Hudson Bay is, for all intents and purposes, an inland sea. It's notorious for violent, unpredictable storms. Could they have lost 10 men in a squall on Hudson Bay, not the Atlantic? Fit. The theory was elegant. It was compelling, but it was still just a theory. Lines on a map. To prove it, supporters needed more. They needed physical evidence on the ground, a trail of breadcrumbs left by these Norse explorers along this proposed water route. So they started looking, and they started finding things. All along the Nelson, the Red River, and the lakes in between, people began reporting strange artifacts. Most were dismissed, but one type of artifact kept appearing over and over, in a pattern that was hard to ignore. They were called mooring stones. These were not small rocks. They were large, heavy boulders, often weighing several hundred pounds, firmly embedded in the shores of lakes and rivers. And drilled into them were perfectly cut, triangular holes. The kind of hole you would make with a medieval steel drill bit. The kind of hole you could pass a rope through or drop an iron pin into to moor a ship. Why a triangular hole? A round hole allows a pin to wobble and wear away the rock. A square hole is difficult to cut, but a triangular hole holds a pin tight in any direction. It's a clever bit of low-tech engineering. And these stones were found consistently along the proposed Viking route. One near the town of Cormorant, Minnesota, another one here, another one there. A chain of them leading right towards Kensington. Of course, the skeptics had explanations. They were for logging booms, they said. Or they were made by 19th century surveyors. Or they were just strange natural formations. But the holes showed clear signs of being drilled. And many were in locations that made no sense for logging or surveying. They were exactly where a crew, paddling and sailing upstream against the current, would need to stop and anchor for the night. The mooring stones were tantalizing. But they weren't the smoking gun. The real test came from the stone itself. Remember that second clue? A lake with two skerries. The stone was found on a hillside, but in the 1300s, during a period of much higher rainfall known as the Little Ice Age, water levels were significantly higher. The area around Olaf Omen's farm would have been a vast, marshy lake. And poking out of that lake, about a day's journey north of the find site, would have been two small rocky islands. Two skerries. Just as the inscription described. The pieces were falling into place. A plausible water route. A chain of mysterious mooring stones marking the way. A local geography that perfectly matched the description carved into the rock. The map was no longer an enemy of the Kensington Runestone. It was becoming its greatest ally. The journey was possible. The location made sense. But this only deepened the mystery. Because it answered the question of how, but it screamed the question of why. Why would a party of 30 Norsemen, a mix of Swedes and Norwegians, undertake one of the most perilous journeys imaginable? Why would they sail thousands of miles from home, deep into an unknown and hostile continent, following a river system to its source in the middle of nowhere? They weren't settlers. The inscription makes it clear it was an exploration party. But what were they exploring for? What could possibly be worth that risk? This wasn't a casual sightseeing trip. This was a mission. The answer wasn't on the stone, and it wasn't on the map of Minnesota. To find it, researchers had to look at a different map. A map of 14th century Europe. They had to look at the political turmoil, the religious crusades, and the desperate ambitions of a king on the edge of the world. The journey to Minnesota, it turned out, may not have started in Greenland, but in the royal court of a forgotten kingdom, with a command from a king to save the very soul of Christendom. The year is 1347. The Black Death sweeps across Europe like a phantom, leaving silence and desolation in its wake. In the far north, the dual kingdom of Norway and Sweden is reeling. Its king, Magnus Eriksson, rules over a realm stretched thin, a kingdom of fjords and forests teetering on the edge of collapse. The plague has decimated his people, emptied his treasury, and shaken the very foundations of his power. But the king has another problem, a spiritual crisis festering at the far western edge of his domain, Greenland. For years, reports had trickled back to Europe, whispers of a colony losing its way. The Greenlanders, isolated for centuries, were said to be turning to the people of America, abandoning their churches, their faith, their very European identity. This was apostasy, a cancer growing on the body of Christendom, and for a medieval king whose legitimacy was tied directly to God, this was an intolerable offense. In 1354, with his kingdom still scarred by plague, King Magnus issued a royal decree. He commanded a nobleman, a trusted law speaker named Paul Knutsen, to assemble a ship and a crew. The mission was not one of conquest or exploration in the way we think of it. It was a rescue mission, a spiritual crusade. Knutsen was ordered to sail to Greenland and uphold Christianity among the wayward colonists. This document, this royal command, is not a myth. It's a real historical record, preserved in a 17th century copy. And it is the absolute bedrock of the most compelling theory for the Kensington Runestone's authenticity. This theory posits that when Paul Knutsen and his men arrived in Greenland, they found a ghost town. The western settlement, once a thriving community of several hundred people, was completely abandoned. The churches were empty, the longhouses silent. Where did they go? The theory suggests that Knutsen, piecing together clues from the remaining eastern settlement or local Inuit, learned that the colonists had gone west. They had sailed toward Vinland, the land of vines and timber discovered by Leif Erikson 3 centuries earlier, a land that had passed into legend but was never truly forgotten. Faced with a choice, return to Norway having failed his king, or pursue these lost souls into the unknown, Knutsen made a fateful decision. He would follow them. He would fulfill his sacred duty, but he wouldn't take the old coastal route. The theory proposes a far more daring and far more direct path, a journey straight into the gaping maw of the North American continent. Proponents of this theory, led for decades by the relentless Hjalmar Holland, trace a breathtaking route. Knutsen and his men sail west from Greenland, through the treacherous Davis Strait, and into the vast, icy expanse of Hudson Bay. From there they find the mouth of the Nelson River, a massive waterway that snakes its way deep into the heart of the continent. For months they would have sailed and rowed against the current, dragging their ship over rapids and portages, pushing deeper and deeper into a land no European had ever seen. This was not the gentle coast of Vinland. This was a brutal, unforgiving wilderness. And it was here in the dead center of the continent that disaster struck. According to the stone's inscription, 10 of their men were left behind by the sea dead. This detail, once a point of confusion, suddenly makes a chilling kind of sense. The sea they were by wasn't the Atlantic Ocean. It was a massive inland lake, perhaps Lake Winnipeg, a body of water so vast it appears as an inland sea. After the tragedy, the remaining party pushed south, eventually reaching what is now west-central Minnesota. Exhausted, depleted, and with winter approaching, a small group of them went out on a fishing trip. When they returned, they found a scene of horror. 10 of their comrades slaughtered, red with blood and dead. It is here, in this moment of profound grief and terror, that the survivors carve their story into a slab of gray wax stone. They are claiming the land, yes, but it is more than that. It is a memorial, a final testament, a desperate prayer left in the heart of a hostile continent. And the date they carve, 1362, 8 years after Paul Knutsen received his orders from King Magnus, a timeline that fits perfectly. This theory doesn't just explain the date and location. It brilliantly explains the stone's most specific and puzzling detail. The inscription reads, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians. Why Goths? The term Goth in the 14th century was a common term for a Swede, particularly from the region of Gotaland. And who was the king who sent Paul Knutsen on his mission? Magnus Eriksson, king of both Norway and Sweden. Knutsen's crew would have been a mixed company, drawn from both halves of the king's realm. 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians. It's not a random detail. It's a precise demographic snapshot that aligns perfectly with the political reality of Scandinavia in the mid-1300s. For believers in the stone, this isn't just a clue, it's a fingerprint. The royal decree of 1354 provides the motive and the mission. The geography of Hudson Bay provides the route. And the dual monarchy of King Magnus provides the identity of the men themselves. The case seems airtight, a forgotten chapter of history etched in stone finally explained. But history is never that simple. Just as this elegant, compelling narrative was solidifying, the skeptics sharpened their knives, and they aimed right for the heart of the evidence, the words themselves. The attack was led by a new generation of Scandinavian linguists, chief among them Professor Erik Wahlgren of UCLA. In the 1950s, Wahlgren published a book that systematically dismantled the stone's language, rune by rune, word by word. He argued that while the Paul Knutsen story was a fantastic tale, the object at the center of it was a fraud. The language on the stone, he declared, was not the Old Norse of the 14th century. It was a bizarre mishmash, a sort of 19th century Scandi-American dialect spoken by immigrants in places like Minnesota, peppered with anachronisms and outright errors. Wahlgren and others pointed to numerous red flags. For instance, the word for day's journey, dagreis, appears on the stone. Critics argued this was a direct borrowing from English, a loanword that a 14th century Norseman would never have used. They would have used the term dogr. The numbers were another huge problem. The stone uses a decimal system for numbers like 8, 10, 22, and 14. But 14th century runic inscriptions almost universally used a different system for numbers above 10, a kind of duodecimal or long hundred counting method. The numbering on the stone looked suspiciously modern. Then there were the runes themselves. Some of them seemed to be younger forms that only came into common use centuries after 1362. Others were carved in ways that suggested the carver didn't have a native fluency, as if they were working from a textbook or a rune key. Wahlgren's conclusion was brutal. The inscription was a monumental hoax, likely carved by Olaf Oman himself or with the help of a local pastor with a dilettante's interest in runes. The language wasn't a message from the past. It was a reflection of the unique linguistic environment of late 19th century Minnesota, where Swedish, Norwegian, and English were all colliding and blending together in the mouths of immigrants. The Paul Knudsen expedition, as romantic as it was, had nothing to do with it. The stone was a product not of a medieval king's command, but of a modern farmer's fantasy. And so the battle lines were drawn. On one side, a powerful historical narrative backed by a royal decree, explaining the who, the why, and the where. On the other, a meticulous linguistic deconstruction, claiming the what, the very words on the stone, was an impossible fiction. It was the grand sweeping story of a holy mission versus the cold, hard analysis of grammar and runes. One side had to be wrong. The stone couldn't be both a genuine message from a lost expedition and a clumsy 19th century forgery. The two realities were mutually exclusive. And as the debate raged, the focus began to shift from the words on the stone to the man who found it and the community he lived in. A community with its own secrets, its own stories, and its own surprising connections to the ancient world. Olof Åman was by all accounts a man of the earth, a Swedish immigrant who had carved a life out of the harsh Minnesota landscape. He was a farmer, a stonemason, a man more comfortable with an axe than a book. His neighbors described him as honest, hard-working, and deeply religious. He wasn't known for jokes or flights of fancy, so when the academic world pointed a finger at him, calling him a forger, the accusation just didn't seem to fit the man. How could this simple farmer, with barely a few years of formal schooling, have crafted a hoax so intricate that it fooled experts and ignited a national debate? The answer, according to the skeptics, wasn't just in Olof Åman himself, but in the world he inhabited. Kensington, Minnesota in 1898 was not just a random spot on the map. It was the heart of a vibrant, tightly knit Scandinavian-American community. These were families who had left everything behind in Sweden and Norway, crossing an ocean to build a new future. They brought with them their language, their Lutheran faith, and a fierce, almost defiant pride in their heritage. In the late 19th century, America was a cultural melting pot, but it wasn't always a welcoming one. Immigrants were often seen as other, their accents mocked, their traditions viewed with suspicion. For these Scandinavian settlers, their Viking past wasn't just ancient history. It was a source of strength. It was a reminder that their ancestors were not peasants, but legendary explorers, warriors, and kings who had once dominated the known world. This cultural pride manifested in a phenomenon some historians call rune fever. Back in Scandinavia, there was a major revival of interest in Viking history and mythology. This wasn't just dusty academic work. It was a popular movement. Books were published, poems were written, and people became fascinated with the ancient runic alphabet. This fascination traveled across the Atlantic with the immigrants. In parlors and church basements across the Midwest, people would discuss the sagas, study runic charts, and even try their hand at carving runes themselves. It was a way of connecting with a glorious past while living a life of grueling farm labor. So, the idea of creating a runestone wasn't necessarily born out of a desire to commit academic fraud. It could have been born from something much more personal, a desire to plant a flag, to write their own history into the very soil of their new home. Imagine the thrill, proving that their people, the Norsemen, had walked this same land, breathed this same air, 500 years before the celebrated Christopher Columbus. It would be the ultimate validation. It would elevate their entire community from simple immigrant farmers to the inheritors of America's true first European explorers. This is the context into which Olof Åman steps back into the picture. Was he acting alone? The skeptics think not. They began to look at his circle of friends and neighbors, and one name in particular stood out: Sven Fogelblad. Fogelblad was a fascinating and enigmatic figure in the Kensington community. Unlike Åman, he was not a simple farmer. He was a former student of Lund University in Sweden who had trained to be a minister. He was highly educated, well-read, and had a library that was the envy of his neighbors. And crucially, Fogelblad had a deep, documented interest in Scandinavian history and runes. He owned books that contained runic alphabets, including some that detailed the very kinds of late-period runes that appeared on the Kensington stone. He was also known for a certain creative and perhaps mischievous streak. He'd even reportedly dabbled in hypnotism. Suddenly, the picture of a lone, uneducated farmer creating the stone begins to fade, replaced by a much more plausible scenario: a collaboration. The theory goes that Fogelblad was the brains of the operation. He had the knowledge, the books, and the intellectual curiosity to craft the inscription. He could have worked out the grammar, the specific runic forms, and the historical narrative. But Fogelblad was a man of books, not stone. He needed a craftsman. He needed someone with strong hands, an intimate knowledge of local rock, and the skill to carve with precision. He needed a stonemason. He needed his friend and neighbor, Olaf Oman. This theory paints a compelling picture. Oman, the honest, simple farmer, could have been brought into the plan, perhaps not even fully understanding the academic implications. Maybe he was told it was a kind of tribute, a community project, a grand joke on the stuffy academics back east. He provides the labor and the perfect discovery story, finding the stone tangled in the roots of an aspen tree on his own property. It was the perfect cover. Who would suspect him? Supporting this theory are some tantalizing clues. Decades after the discovery, investigators found a small almanac that had belonged to Olaf Oman. In it, scribbled in the margins, were what appeared to be practice runes. Specifically, he had written out the runic alphabet, and tellingly, he had made a few mistakes. Mistakes that mirrored some of the unusual or incorrect runes found on the stone itself. Was this the smoking gun? Was this Olaf Oman practicing the script fed to him by Fogelblad before he took his chisel to the stone? Furthermore, there was the matter of Oman's own testimony, which seemed to shift over time. In a sworn affidavit from 1909, he stated, "I have never in my life been a student of runes or runic writing." Yet, later reports and family stories suggested he did have an interest, and perhaps even owned a few books on the subject himself. And then there's the curious case of a man named John Gran. In the 1970s, long after the main players were gone, Gran's children came forward with a story. They claimed that on his deathbed, their father confessed that the Kensington Runestone was a hoax, and that he had heard Olaf Oman himself admit it was all a big joke. The case against Oman and Fogelblad seemed to be building. They had the means, Fogelblad's knowledge and Oman's skill. They had the motive, immigrant pride and a desire to rewrite history. And they had the opportunity, living in a remote, isolated community where such a project could be undertaken in secret. The story of the simple farmer stumbling upon an ancient artifact was replaced by a conspiracy of two, or maybe even more, clever Scandinavian immigrants planting a piece of their own history in American soil. It was a brilliant, romantic, and almost understandable deception. But here's the problem with a good story. It's not always the truth. For every piece of evidence that pointed to a hoax, there was a counterargument. Oman's defenders claimed the practice runes in his almanac were not practice at all, but were simply copied down after he found the stone, out of pure curiosity. As for the deathbed confession of John Gran, it was third-hand hearsay, decades after the fact. Could it be trusted? And what about Oman himself? He stuck to his story for the rest of his life, through ridicule and suspicion, never wavering. He swore on a Bible that his account was true. He never sought fame or fortune from the stone. In fact, it brought him a great deal of trouble and unwanted attention. He seemed genuinely bewildered by the controversy. If this was a performance, it was the performance of a lifetime, maintained with perfect consistency until the day he died. Was this simple farmer truly a master actor, capable of deceiving the world for over 40 years? Or was he exactly what he appeared to be? An honest man who found something extraordinary, something that the world just wasn't ready to believe? The focus had been on the men, on their character and their community, but the stone itself still held secrets. And a new generation of researchers, armed with new technology and a fresh perspective, were about to find linguistic clues hidden in plain sight, clues that neither a 14th century Viking nor a 19th century hoaxer should have ever known. To understand the new case for the Kensington Runestone, we have to flip the entire argument on its head. For nearly a century, academics had been pointing to a list of so-called errors on the stone as definitive proof of a hoax. The grammar was messy, a jumble of Swedish and Norwegian. The runes themselves looked off. Certain letters and numbers seemed to be outright inventions. The critics argued that no 14th century Norseman would have written this way. But the new question posed by researchers like Richard Nielsen and Scott Walter was this: what if those aren't errors? What if they're fingerprints? Let's start with the runes themselves. One of the biggest red flags for early scholars was the shape of certain letters. The stone used a hooked X shape for the letter G, a rune with two dots above it for the letter A, and a peculiar rune for the letter J. Mainstream runologists in the early 20th century looked at these and said, Nope. These don't exist in the 14th century runic alphabet. They declared them to be the clumsy inventions of a modern forger. For decades, that was the end of the story. But Richard Nielsen, an engineer with a passion for Scandinavian languages, wasn't convinced. He spent years, decades even, digging through obscure medieval documents, church records from remote parishes in Sweden and Norway, and forgotten manuscripts stored in dusty European archives. And he started finding things. He discovered that the so-called invented runes weren't inventions at all. They were rare, regional variations. The hooked X for G? It appeared in documents from the specific Swedish province of Bohuslän. The stranger with 2 dots? It was a known, albeit uncommon, form from the same era. These weren't mistakes, they were dialect. It was like an American writing the word color, and a British person writing color. Both are correct, they just point to a different origin. The runes on the stone suggested the carver came from a very specific part of Scandinavia. Then there were the numbers. The date on the stone, 1362, is carved using a mix of normal runes and a strange set of symbols that scholars had never seen before. They dismissed it as a fantasy, something Olof Oman must have made up because he didn't know how to write numbers properly in runes. But again, Nielsen and others kept digging. They found that this numbering system, known as a pentatic system, wasn't a fantasy at all. It was a real, albeit archaic, system used by Scandinavian merchants and farmers well into the 19th century. More importantly, they found versions of it in a 14th century Icelandic manuscript, proving it existed during the time of the alleged voyage. The forger, it seemed, had correctly used a numbering system so obscure that the world's leading experts didn't even know it existed in 1898. This pattern kept repeating itself. Every supposed mistake that pointed to a 19th century hoax began to look more like a clue pointing to a very specific 14th century origin. Take the language itself. The inscription is a chaotic mix of Old Swedish and Old Norwegian, with words and grammar from both. To early critics, this was the ultimate sign of an amateur. A real Norse expedition would have been consistent, they argued. But think about it. The inscription says it was a party of 8 Swedes or Goths and 22 Norwegians. What happens when a mixed group of people who speak similar but distinct dialects spend months or years together, isolated from everyone else? Their languages start to blend. They form a Creole, a pidgin language. The messy language on the stone wasn't a sign of a forger's ignorance. It was arguably the most realistic detail of all, a perfect linguistic snapshot of a mixed crew far from home. One of the most damning pieces of evidence for the hoax theory was the phrase, optigelsusregi, which translates to journey of discovery. Scholars in the early 20th century were adamant this was a modern word, a 19th century creation. A 14th century Viking would have used a different term, like fard or risa. This was considered a smoking gun. But in the late 1990s, with the rise of digital archives, researchers were able to scan and search millions of pages of medieval texts. And there it was. They found forms of the word optigels, to discover, in Scandinavian documents dating back to the 1300s. It was rare, but it was real. Another smoking gun that turned out to be a dud. Perhaps the most compelling linguistic clue is the abbreviation AVM, which stands for Ave Maria, or Hail Mary. The inscription asks AVM to save them from evil. For a century, critics argued this was proof of a modern Catholic forger. They claimed that this specific abbreviation and the prayer itself only became popular in the 15th and 16th centuries, long after 1362. But historical research has since revealed that the Ave Maria prayer was heavily promoted by the Cistercian order, an order of monks who were intimately linked with the Knights Templar. Not only was the prayer in use, but the abbreviation AVM has been found on other artifacts from the 14th century. The prayer wasn't an anachronism. It was a potential link to the very group some believe sponsored the secret mission into America's heartland. So let's step back and look at the picture that's forming. To believe the Kensington Runestone is a hoax, you have to believe in a forger of almost supernatural intellect and foresight. You have to believe that Olof Oman, or someone in his circle, wasn't just a farmer with a book. He was a linguistic prodigy. He would have had to possess a deeper knowledge of medieval Scandinavian dialects than the top professors at Uppsala and Oslo universities. He would have had to know about rare, regional runic variants from specific parishes that scholars wouldn't uncover for another 70 years. He would have had to know about an obscure pentatonic numbering system that had been lost to history, but was hidden away in an Icelandic manuscript. He would have had to know the precise etymological roots of the word optigels, and known that while it was rare, it was period appropriate. He would have had to perfectly mimic the linguistic drift of a mixed Swedish-Norwegian crew, and then, after creating this masterpiece of historical and linguistic deception, he had to intentionally add just enough perceived errors to make it look fake to his contemporaries, but real to future generations armed with digital databases. This is the hoaxer's paradox. The more we learn, the more the evidence against the stone seems to melt away, and the more unbelievable the profile of the forger becomes. The simple farmer from Minnesota morphs into a shadowy, Dan Brown-esque mastermind, a historical savant who played a joke on the entire world, a joke so complex that it took us 100 years to even begin to understand the punchline. The argument is no longer about a simple farmer faking a Viking message. The new evidence forces us to ask a much more difficult question. Which is more plausible? A desperate group of 14th century explorers, carving a message with their own regional quirks and linguistic habits? Or a 19th century genius, a farmer scholar who knew things that no one else on Earth knew, who crafted the most elaborate and intellectually demanding prank in human history, and then took the secret to his grave, content to be remembered as a simpleton and a liar? The stone was either carved by the men it describes, or it was carved by a ghost, a historical phantom whose genius exceeded that of everyone who would study his work for the next century. And if it wasn't the Vikings and it couldn't have been Omen, then who are we left with? Who on earth could have carved this stone? The answer, it turns out, might not be a single person at all. Because while Olof Oman might have been the face of the discovery, he wasn't alone in the isolated, tight-knit Swedish community of Kensington, Minnesota. And among his neighbors and acquaintances was a man who possessed all the esoteric knowledge, the linguistic skill, and the mischievous intellect that Oman so clearly lacked. A man who fits the profile of our ghost-like genius perfectly. His name was Sven Fogelblad. Fogelblad was not a simple farmer. He was a former clergyman and teacher from Sweden, a man steeped in the classics, history, and languages. He had received a formal university-level education, the kind of education that would have exposed him to Latin, to history, and yes, to runes. But Fogelblad was also a man with a troubled past. After being defrocked for doctrinal disputes, he immigrated to America, carrying his immense knowledge and perhaps a chip on his shoulder. He was known in the community as a polymath, a bit of an eccentric, and a lover of elaborate practical jokes. He was also a close associate of Olof Oman. Suddenly, the impossible puzzle starts to look solvable. We aren't looking for one man who was both a humble farmer and a master philologist. We are looking for a partnership, a collaboration. Olof Oman had the land, the stone, the credibility of a simple working man, and the perfect backstory. Sven Fogelblad had the brains. He had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. Let's talk about the means. In Fogelblad's personal library, which was inventoried after his death, investigators found a treasure trove. He owned books on Scandinavian history, mythology, and crucially books that contained alphabets of runes. One book in particular, a popular Swedish-American humor periodical called The Merry Youth, contained an article about secret codes. And what did this article feature? A runic alphabet that mixed and matched elder and younger Futhark runes in exactly the same idiosyncratic way as the Kensington stone. It even included the same unusual hooked X rune. The smoking gun, the very specific set of errors and anachronisms that baffled experts for decades, was sitting right there on Fogelblad's bookshelf. He didn't need to be the world's leading runologist. He just needed to be a good copyist. All the strange grammar, the modern-sounding words like Optigelsesvard or Journey of Discovery, the peculiar numbering system, it all starts to make sense not as a 14th century text, but as a 19th century text created by an educated Swede using the specific reference materials he had at hand. Now for the motive. Why would an educated man like Fogelblad conspire with a farmer to create such an elaborate hoax? It certainly wasn't for money or fame. Fogelblad died before the stone ever became truly famous, and Oman went to his grave a poor man, hounded by skeptics. The answer is deeper, and it lies in the cultural landscape of late 19th century America. This was an era of intense immigrant pride. The United States was a melting pot, and every ethnic group was scrambling to carve out its own piece of the American story. to prove its own historical importance. The Irish had the legend of St. Brendan discovering America. The Welsh had their story of Prince Madoc. Leif Erikson was just beginning to be celebrated as a point of Scandinavian pride against the overwhelming dominance of the Italian Christopher Columbus. In this environment, creating a tangible piece of history, a Viking artifact found right there in the heart of a Scandinavian American community, wasn't just a prank. It was a powerful cultural statement. It was a way of saying, we were here first. This land is our history too. We have roots here that go deeper than anyone imagined. It was an act of what you might call patriotic forgery. Fogelblad and Oman weren't trying to trick the world for personal gain. They were likely trying to create a founding myth for their people in a new land. They were planting a story in the soil of Minnesota, a story that would give their community a sense of historical legitimacy and profound connection to the place they now called home. Olaf Oman, the honest farmer, finds the stone entwined in the roots of a tree on his land. The symbolism is almost too perfect. It's a story of heritage literally unearthed from the American soil. When you look at it through this lens, everything clicks into place. The stone's weathering isn't from 500 years of burial, it's from 30 or 40 years of exposure before being discovered. Perhaps after being carved and left in a field or swamp by Fogelblad and Oman, waiting for the right moment. The choice of Greywack, a local stone, makes perfect sense. The narrative of the journey, ending in tragedy and a claim to the land, is the perfect romantic story for a founding myth. The partnership between the intellectual Fogelblad and the salt of the earth Oman provided the perfect cover. One man had the knowledge, the other had the unimpeachable, simple credibility. So where does that leave us? The Kensington Runestone is almost certainly not a genuine 14th century Viking artifact. The linguistic, geological, and archaeological evidence against it is simply overwhelming. But to dismiss it as just a hoax is to miss the point entirely. It's not a worthless fraud. Something far more fascinating. The Kensington Runestone is a uniquely American artifact. Not from the 14th century, but from the 19th. It doesn't tell a story of medieval explorers lost in the wilderness. It tells a much more intimate and relatable story. A story of immigrants trying to find their place in a new world. It's a story of identity, of the deep human need to belong, and of the lengths people will go to create a history that gives their lives meaning and significance. The stone's enduring power isn't in its authenticity, but in the compelling narrative it represents, both the one carved on its face and the one surrounding its creation. It's a testament to the idea that a good story can be more powerful than the truth. For over a century, it has sparked debate, inspired passion, and forced us to ask profound questions about evidence, belief, and the very nature of history itself. The stone may not be proof of Vikings in America before Columbus, but it stands as undeniable proof of the hopes, ambitions, and anxieties of the Scandinavian pioneers who helped build the American Midwest. It's a relic not of a failed expedition, but of a successful act of modern myth-making. The Kensington Runestone may not be the history we were looking for, but in the end it might just be a more interesting, more human, and more American story than we could have ever imagined. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through history, mystery, and controversy. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next investigation. And now I want to hear from you. After all this evidence, what do you believe? Is the runestone a Viking relic, a simple farmer's prank, or a complex cultural statement? Let me know your verdict in the comments below.